The scream shattered the stillness of the cul-de-sac like a jagged crack in glass. 1 second, my disabled daughter was giggling softly on the porch, hugging her favorite stuffed bear. The same one she clutched every night for comfort, the same one that had calmed her during countless panic attacks. And in the very next moment, a gunshot rang out. The sound was surreal, distant, yet deafening. I turned just in time to see Karen, our self-appointed HOA queen, lowering a black handgun, her face twisted with something between fear and righteous fury. My daughter's body slumped, her arms slack as the toy slipped from her hands and hit the porch with a sickening flop, its chest torn open, stuffing soaked with blood. For a split second, no one moved. The air itself seemed to freeze. I dropped everything and sprinted toward my baby, my heart pounding in my ears louder than the shot itself. Karen's voice broke the silence. Cold, flat, unfeeling. She hid something inside it, she said, pointing at the bear, as if that explained the bullet, as if that justified the blood now pooling around my child's feet. I looked down at the toy. It seemed split, revealing nothing but cotton and the worn, frayed cloth of years of love. There was no weapon, no threat, only innocence, only comfort. And Karen had destroyed it without blinking. The neighborhood, once a place of quiet lawns and polite nods, now stood stunned, witnesses to a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. No warning, no confrontation, just a loaded accusation and a louder gun. And as I held my trembling daughter, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with terror, I realized that no amount of explanations or justice would ever stitch that toy or her trust back together. She said my daughter was hiding something inside the toy, but it was just her comfort. Our neighborhood looked like something out of a picture-perfect magazine ad. Manicured lawns, pastel mailboxes, kids biking up and down the cul-de-sac, and small American flags flapping neatly in the breeze. From the outside, it gave off an air of calm predictability, a slice of suburban heaven wrapped in HOA regulations and weekend barbecues. We moved here for that very promise. Safety, stability, normalcy. As the father of a child with special needs, that meant everything to me. My daughter, Ellie, had endured more than her fair share of challenges. Her disability made even everyday routines feel like uphill battles. But she was resilient, bright, and full of wonder. What she couldn't express with words, she conveyed with the tightness of her hugs, the sparkle in her eyes, and the little bear she carried everywhere, a worn, floppy thing she named Button after the single-stitched eye that had survived years of cuddles and surgeries. It wasn't just a toy to her. It was a piece of her soul stitched into soft fabric. It had seen her through meltdowns, hospital stays, and the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. Every morning, we'd sit on the porch for exactly 10 minutes before school. That was Ellie's routine. She liked watching the sunlight pour through the trees, the way it made the cracks in the sidewalk glow golden. She'd hold Button close, sometimes humming a tune only she understood. Neighbors would wave, most of them kindly. But there was always one house whose curtains twitched just a little too long, one pair of eyes that never blinked kindly. Karen. Karen was the HOA president, a self-appointed gatekeeper of suburban perfection. She had a way of making her presence known without ever raising her voice. Her smile was practiced, always 2 seconds too long, and it never quite reached her eyes. She wasn't overtly cruel, not at first. It was in the small things. A note left in our mailbox saying our porch toys violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood. A complaint about unapproved colors in Ellie's sidewalk chalk drawings. She once even knocked on our door to let us know that stuffed animals left outside lower property appeal, all of it masked in polite concern, veiled in HOA jargon, signed with her neat, cursive signature. I tried to brush it off. I told myself she was just rigid, a rule follower to a fault. But Ellie noticed. Even if she didn't always understand the words, she felt the tone. She began to withdraw during our porch time. Her eyes would flick nervously toward Karen's house. Some mornings, she clutched Button a little tighter. Other times, she'd ask if they were allowed to sit outside. "Did Miss Lady say we can?" she'd whisper. That broke me in ways I didn't show her. Still, we pressed on. I reassured her with gentle words and warm cocoa. I emailed the HOA with questions, concerns. Each time, the reply was the same: we appreciate your feedback. Compliance is expected of all residents. No resolution. No empathy. Then came the packages. It started with small things: a box of sensory toys from Ellie's therapist left on our doorstep. We found it torn open, contents spilled. We thought it was a delivery error. Then it happened again. And again. One day, the delivery man told me someone tried to stop him from placing a package on our porch, saying this house is under review. When I asked who, he shrugged. Some lady in beige. Had a clipboard. I confronted Karen politely, of course. I asked her if she knew anything about the missing or damaged packages. She smiled and said, "Oh, I assumed you were being watched by social services. You know, for her condition." Her voice dropped on the last word, like it was something contagious. I stood there stunned. She just waved, turned, and went back into her house like she hadn't just insulted both of us. That night, I filed a formal complaint. I even recorded the interaction, but the HOA dismissed it. No clear violation. It felt like screaming into a void. The next week, Button went missing. It was Ellie who noticed. She had left it on the porch chair, part of the routine, and when we returned after a short walk, it was gone. She panicked, spiraling into a meltdown. We searched the whole block, even the trash bins. Nothing. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept asking, what if he's scared? What if he's cold? And I had no answers. 2 days later, Button was back, sitting neatly on our porch chair, cleaner than I remembered, his stitching oddly straighter, his stuffing somehow tighter. It was him, and yet it wasn't. Ellie clutched him with hesitation, tilting her head like she could sense something was wrong. She slept with him that night anyway, desperate for comfort. I should have trusted her instinct. Something had changed in those calm days leading up to the storm. The air grew heavier. Karen became more visible, walking by our house more often, lingering longer than necessary. Once, I caught her squinting at Ellie through binoculars from her upstairs window. I took a picture, brought it to the HOA. They said it was likely birdwatching. When I asked them to review her position, I was told that as long as she upheld HOA bylaws, she was within her rights. The worst part was the isolation. Neighbors I once chatted with began crossing the street to avoid small talk. A few even nodded toward Karen's house like to warn me, don't cross her. Ellie felt it too. She spoke less, smiled less. She began whispering to Button in ways she hadn't before, like she needed him to understand her fear. Her questions grew darker. Will someone take me too? What if the mean lady doesn't like me? I wanted to believe we were just being paranoid, that the sun would rise and reset things, but deep down, something in my bones told me otherwise. That Karen wasn't just annoyed. She was watching, waiting, and whatever she thought was wrong in our home, she believed it was her duty to fix it. The morning of the incident was bright, too bright, the sky too clear. Ellie sat with Button on the porch, tracing a heart on the wooden armrest with her finger. I remember smiling at the peacefulness of it. I remember thinking maybe today will be different. And I remember the way my heart froze when I saw Karen step outside, clipboard in one hand, something black in the other. I didn't know that was the last calm moment we'd ever have in that neighborhood. The days that followed were a slow, creeping descent into something I couldn't name at the time. A thick fog of dread seemed to settle over our home, as if the very walls could sense something terrible approaching. We continued our porch routine with Ellie, but even those 10 minutes began to feel strained. The neighborhood's tranquility had turned sharp and unnatural, like the pause before a scream. It began, as it always seemed to, with a complaint. This one came in the form of a formal HOA notice, slipped into our mailbox in a manila envelope stamped with that ever-familiar red emblem. Urgent. HOA violation. Inside, in perfectly typed language, was a notice claiming that soft exterior items left in visible areas may contribute to perceived disorderliness and were therefore in violation of neighborhood visual compliance standards. Translation: Button wasn't welcome on our porch. I stood at the kitchen counter reading it while Ellie sat nearby, gently rocking Button in her arms. She had no idea her best friend had been labeled a visual nuisance. I crumpled the paper, then took a breath and smoothed it out again. I wasn't going to let a letter shake our peace. But it didn't stop there. The next morning, a sticky note was left on our front door. No envelope, no signature, just the words. Toys can be hiding spots. You never know what people slip inside. It made my stomach churn. The handwriting was narrow, slanted, too deliberate to be casual. My mind instantly went to Karen. I knocked on her door that evening. She opened it wearing that practiced grin, sipping a glass of something pink. "Can I help you?" she asked, like I was a door-to-door salesman. "Did you leave this on my door?" I held out the note. Her smile widened slightly, eyes flashing. "Oh goodness, no. But I have seen some concerning things. Packages being dropped off at odd hours. Toys left unattended. It's not just about your daughter, dear. It's about safety. We all want what's best for our community." The passive aggression dripped off every word. I wanted to shout, but I didn't. I turned and walked away. 2 days later, Button was gone. It was one of those mornings when Ellie felt particularly at ease. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, and she was humming one of her little made-up songs. She set Button on the porch chair beside her while I went inside for her water bottle. When I came back out, less than 2 minutes later, the chair was empty. Ellie froze, her mouth open but no sound coming out. She pointed, eyes wide. He was there. He was right there. We searched the yard, then the bushes, then the whole street. Nothing. I checked with our closest neighbors. No one had seen anything. One said, "Maybe an animal took it?" I wanted to believe that, but my gut told me otherwise. Ellie didn't sleep that night. She kept sitting up in bed, whispering, "Is Button cold? What if he thinks I left him?" I wrapped my arms around her, murmuring comforts I didn't believe myself. 3 days later, Button reappeared. He was sitting on our porch swing in the early morning, just as the sun rose. At first, I felt relief, then confusion, then dread, because something was off. The stitching on his chest looked different, cleaner, too precise. The tear on his right leg had been sewn shut, not with Ellie's colorful thread, but with a sterile white line that looked like it came from a repair shop. I picked him up carefully. He felt firmer, like he had been restuffed. I squeezed him. There was something solid inside, a small, firm object in the center of his belly. I panicked. I grabbed scissors and opened the seam. Inside, tucked between the stuffing, was a tiny black box. I pulled it out slowly. It was a tracker, a real, functioning GPS tracker. I stared at it in horror, barely able to breathe. Who the hell would do this? I called the police. An officer came, took a statement, and collected the device. He didn't seem surprised. Said these things were more common than people thought. Told me to be cautious. Nothing else. That night, I installed cameras. One at the porch, one facing Karen's house. Ellie was shaken. She didn't want to touch Button for days. She asked if he was still safe or if he had been turned bad. I assured her it was just a mistake, a weird one, but she wasn't convinced. She kept looking out the window at Karen's house. The footage from the camera came back the next day. Around 5:17 a.m. on the morning Button returned, a figure approached our porch. The image was grainy but clear enough. Beige blazer, clipboard, short blonde hair. It was Karen. She placed Button on the swing gently, then looked directly into the camera, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. She just stared for 3 long seconds before walking away. I took the footage to the HOA. Their response? "We are not a law enforcement body. If a resident has concerns, we encourage them to resolve it through civil means." So I posted the footage online. The video made minor waves. A few disability advocates reached out. Some called it disturbing. A few neighbors became distant. One even warned me, "You don't want to make enemies with her. She has friends in the board." Karen didn't confront me about it, but her behavior shifted. She began walking her dog past our house multiple times a day, always stopping, always staring. Once, I found her crouched by our trash cans. She looked up and said, "Just checking for proper waste separation. Can't have pests." The mail started arriving late or not at all. Packages went missing again. I caught her once standing near our mailbox, pretending to check her phone. When I walked out to confront her, she just smiled and said, "Oh, didn't know you were home." Then came the anonymous calls. Two social workers visited us in 1 week. They said they'd received tips about unusual behavior and suspicious packages related to a minor. Each time, they found nothing. Ellie was safe. Our home was clean, but the visits were invasive and terrifying. Karen was behind it. I was sure of it. Then Ellie began acting strangely. She stopped humming. She began flinching at loud sounds. She refused to sit on the porch. One evening, she asked, "Daddy, if someone shoots a toy, do the hugs come out?" That question gutted me. I decided we had to leave. I began looking for new homes, new neighborhoods. Quietly, secretly, but it was too late. Karen had sunk her claws in deep, and she was watching everything. The final straw came a few days before the incident. We found another note. This one wasn't typed. It was scrawled in that same slanted, narrow hand, taped to the porch light. "If you won't keep your daughter's secrets out of sight, someone else will." No signature. No mercy. I called the police again. They filed a report. No arrest. No warning. Karen stood on her lawn that afternoon, watering her roses, smiling at us like nothing had ever happened. And I realized then what she truly believed, that she was the hero in her story, that she was protecting the neighborhood from some imagined threat, that she saw my daughter, disabled, quiet, different, not as a child, but as a problem to be fixed. We didn't know it yet, but the calm was long gone. We were already standing on the edge of the storm, and all it would take to tip it into disaster was one more accusation. The day it happened began like any other, deceptively ordinary, almost painfully peaceful. The sun rose with that crisp golden hue that made everything look softer, calmer. Birds chirped from the trees lining our porch, and the faint scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air. Ellie, wrapped in her pink hoodie despite the warmth, was already humming her usual tune as she sat on the swing holding Button. Her eyes scanned the quiet street while she gently rocked her favorite toy, pressing it to her cheek like it still carried the warmth of every bedtime and whispered secret. I was inside making breakfast, toast, and scrambled eggs, her favorite, when I glanced out the window and saw her. Karen, standing across the street, not walking her dog, not on a phone call, just standing, arms crossed, eyes locked on Ellie. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. Karen had been escalating things for weeks, yes, but she hadn't crossed any legal line yet, just moral ones. But there was something about the way she stood that morning. Unmoving. Her stare wasn't one of irritation or disapproval. It was sharper, focused, purposeful, like she was waiting for something. I stepped outside and called to Ellie. She looked up at me, smiling. "Button says it's a good day." My heart melted a little. "Then Button's probably right," I said, but I still looked across the street. Karen was gone, vanished behind the corner like a shadow. We sat together for a bit, enjoying the morning breeze. The world, for a few fleeting moments, felt okay. Then I got a phone call. It was the delivery company. They had arrived with Ellie's new therapy chair, but they needed help at the gate. I told Ellie to wait inside, but she insisted, "Just 5 more minutes, please? Button's telling me a story." I hesitated. The porch was safe. The cameras were installed. Everything seemed quiet. "Okay," I said, 5 minutes. Don't leave the porch." I jogged down the street to meet the delivery van just at the corner. I was gone for less than 3 minutes, and in that short window, everything unraveled. I heard the scream first. Not a normal child's scream. Not frustration or surprise. It was the kind of sound that twists your stomach before your brain can even register why. I dropped the clipboard and sprinted toward the house. As I rounded the corner, the sight before me didn't make sense at first. Ellie was still on the porch, curled up, screaming in a pitch I'd never heard come from her. Her hands were clutched to her side. Button lay beside her, shredded open, stuffing scattered across the porch like a snowstorm of cotton and thread. Blood. There was blood, a deep, dark stain seeping into the wood below her. For a second, I froze. Then I saw Karen. She stood at the foot of the porch steps, holding a black handgun pointed low. Her arm trembled slightly, but her face was calm, focused, determined. She hid something inside the toy, she said flatly, as if she were reading from a police report. I had no choice. I launched myself forward and grabbed Ellie, my hands shaking as I tried to assess where she was hit. The bullet had gone through Button, and then into her abdomen, grazing her side. It could have been worse. It could have been fatal. She was sobbing, terrified, barely able to speak. Button, he's broken. Daddy, he's broken. I pressed my hands to the wound, shouting for help, screaming so loudly I could taste copper in my mouth. Karen didn't move. She didn't run. She didn't even look remorseful. There was something inside, she repeated. I saw her tampering with it. Could have been a device. I had to protect us. The neighbors emerged slowly, unsure of what had happened. Some ran. Others stood frozen. One woman finally had the sense to call 911. The police arrived in under 4 minutes. By then, I had wrapped Ellie in a towel, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Karen stood to the side, talking calmly to the first officer. There have been repeated incidents, she said. Suspicious behavior. I've filed several complaints. I had reason to believe she was being used as a mule, possibly for trafficking something illegal. Her voice was steady, almost practiced. The officer looked unsure, glancing between her and me, where I cradled my injured daughter in my arms, blood staining my clothes. An ambulance pulled up. EMTs rushed in and took over. I refused to leave Ellie's side. She kept whispering Button's name over and over again, like she was afraid he'd disappear if she stopped saying it. As they lifted her into the ambulance, I turned back to Karen. My voice shook with rage. You shot my child. My disabled child. Because of a toy. She didn't flinch. Because of what was inside the toy, she corrected. I did what any responsible citizen would do. At the hospital, they rushed Ellie into surgery. The bullet had grazed her liver, but missed any major arteries. The doctors said she'd be okay, physically. Emotionally, that was another story. She woke up crying, calling for Button, asking if she did something wrong. I told her over and over again, no, sweetheart, you did everything right. You were perfect. But she didn't believe me. She kept asking why someone would hurt her for hugging her friend. Back at the house, the investigation unfolded slowly. The detectives found no weapon, no device, no contraband inside Button, just stuffing, thread, and a tiny lavender-scented bead Ellie had tucked inside his ear for comfort. That was it. There was no threat, no reason, only fear, only hate. Karen's story began to shift once the truth came out. She claimed she had credible intel from online forums, that she had seen videos of similar toys being used for criminal purposes, that her training in neighborhood safety told her to act quickly. She refused to apologize, refused to acknowledge Ellie's injury. In fact, she requested a lawyer before giving her full statement. The media caught wind of it soon. A video surfaced, one from a neighbor's doorbell camera, showing Karen walking across the lawn, lifting the gun, shouting, "Show me what's inside," before firing at point-blank range. The footage went viral. Outrage exploded. Disability rights activists spoke out. Journalists camped outside her home. My inbox filled with messages, some kind, others venomous. Karen was arrested for reckless endangerment, unlawful discharge of a firearm, and aggravated assault. But even then, there were people defending her. Online forums spun the story. HOA hero saves community from threat. Some said I was exploiting my daughter. Others said I had planted the tracker. The conspiracy theories multiplied. And through it all, Ellie just kept asking if Button was going to heaven. We held a small ceremony for the toy. I stitched him back together as best I could and placed him in a glass box in her room. She refused to touch him at first. Then one night, I found her asleep with her hand pressed against the glass, whispering, "I quit my job. I couldn't focus." Everything reminded me of that moment. The blood, the bang, her voice crying out, the smell of lavender mixed with iron. I began seeing a therapist, but it didn't help much. Not when I had to look my daughter in the eye every morning and try to pretend the world made sense. The HOA finally removed Karen from her position, but only after public backlash. In private emails, I learned that several board members had tried to suppress complaints against her for months, that they knew about her obsession, that they had even joked about it. "Better not leave toys out or Karen will call the FBI." They laughed until she pulled a trigger. The court proceedings dragged on for months. Karen pleaded not guilty. Her lawyers argued mental instability, stress from neighborhood threats, and a history of paranoia. The judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation. Meanwhile, Ellie's testimony was recorded via video. Watching her recall the moment she was shot, clutching a teddy bear, broke everyone in that courtroom. Even the bailiff wiped his eyes. When the verdict came, it was only partially satisfying. Guilty on all charges. 5 years sentence with eligibility for parole in 2. I wanted justice. What I got was a beginning, not an end. Today, Ellie walks with a small scar across her side and a bigger one in her heart. She still speaks softly, still hums sometimes, but she doesn't sit on the porch anymore. Not without me, and never with Button. As for me, I've turned our story into something more. A warning, a truth, a voice. Because what happened to my daughter wasn't just about one woman or one neighborhood. It was about fear disguised as order, hate disguised as protection, and silence disguised as peace. Karen said she thought there was something hidden inside the toy, and she was right. There was comfort, there was innocence, there was love, and she shot it anyway. The days following the shooting felt like walking through a fog of disbelief and heartbreak. Our house, once a quiet sanctuary filled with laughter and little girl songs, had become a war zone of emotions. Ellie came home from the hospital 3 days later, stitched up and quiet. She barely spoke. Her once expressive face was now guarded, uncertain, and her eyes, those sparkling, curious eyes, seemed older, like she had seen something no child ever should. She didn't want to sleep in her room. She didn't want to go outside. She wouldn't touch Button, even though I had cleaned and patched him up. He now sat untouched on her nightstand, sealed in a clear memory box, almost like a museum relic, a broken witness to the horror we endured. The porch remained off-limits. The swing she used to love creaked in the breeze like a ghost of our past life. Neighbors passed by our house awkwardly. Some brought casseroles and flowers, others avoided eye contact completely. A few brave souls offered whispered apologies, the kind that come too late. One man, a neighbor I barely knew, said, "We always thought Karen was intense, but no one expected this." I wanted to scream. People had known. They'd seen her obsession, her hostility, her escalating behavior. And yet no one did a thing. Not the HOA, not the board, not even the local police. Everyone thought her actions were just part of suburban power trips, another Karen being Karen. But now my daughter had a bullet scar to prove that unchecked power can become violence. The confrontation, the real one, came 4 days later. Karen was out on bail temporarily before her formal arraignment, and she had the audacity to walk past her home. She wasn't subtle. She stopped at the edge of our driveway, arms crossed, watching the front of our house like she was surveying property lines. I saw her through the front window and walked outside, fury boiling beneath my skin. "Get off my property," I growled, standing firm between her and the porch where my daughter had nearly died. Karen tilted her head, her expression as composed as ever. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is," she said coldly. "It was a misunderstanding." I stepped forward, voice trembling with rage. "You shot a 7-year-old girl, threw her toy, and you call that a misunderstanding?" Her gaze narrowed. She wasn't acting normal. She was talking to that thing like it was alive, hiding things, whispering. Her voice cracked slightly. How was I supposed to know she wasn't dangerous? My fists clenched at my sides. I could barely contain the urge to scream. She's disabled, you lunatic. She has sensory processing issues. That bear was her way of coping, of staying calm in a world too loud for her. And you turned it into a weapon. You tried to erase her because you couldn't understand her. Karen's expression shifted for a second, maybe half a second, into something like uncertainty, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I'll be vindicated, she muttered. You'll see. People are on my side. Then she turned and walked away, as if she hadn't left trauma in her wake. I stood there for a long time, fists unclenching slowly, until my neighbor, the same one who brought a candle and a pie, stepped forward and said, "We'll never let her near your family again." It wasn't enough, but it was something. The confrontation didn't end there. I took it further. I spoke out. I gave interviews. I shared Ellie's story. I showed the footage to national outlets. I became the face of a quiet movement, one I never asked to lead. Parents of disabled children reached out. Veterans, teachers, even former HOA members. They shared their stories of being silenced, targeted, overlooked. Karen became a symbol, not just of cruelty, but of the system that enables it. Her HOA connections, her complaints being brushed off, her access to firearms while in a position of community power, it all became a wider discussion. People asked the hard questions. Why was no one listening before it was too late? Why are neighborhood politics often laced with quiet, dangerous prejudice? And why does it take blood for people to open their eyes? Ellie slowly began healing. Her laughter came back in small pieces, a giggle when I tripped over my shoes, a smirk when I made her pancakes in the shape of stars. She started drawing again, filling paper with bright colors and sunshine. One day, she asked for a new bear, not to replace Button, but to help him rest. We bought her a purple one. She named it Hope. She still hasn't gone back to the porch, but she walks by it now without flinching. That's progress. The confrontation wasn't just about Karen. It was about me, too. About learning to protect loudly. To stand firm not just in fear, but in truth. I filed a lawsuit against Karen, against the HOA, against the negligence that enabled this. And this time, people listened. The case is ongoing, but the message has already echoed across communities. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing in the wreckage and refusing to sit down again. That's what this section is, the aftermath and the reckoning. The world now knows what happened on that porch. But more importantly, it knows who Ellie is. Not a victim, but a fighter. Not someone to fear, but someone to love. And as I hold her hand and walk beside her every day, I remind her, and myself, that bravery isn't just in surviving. It's in rising. The investigation that followed was like peeling back the skin of something rotten. Layer by layer, the truth began to stink. At first, it looked straightforward. Karen had shot a disabled child over a stuffed toy, full stop. But as law enforcement dug deeper, it became clear this wasn't a snap decision. It was premeditated, not in the traditional legal sense, but in the deeply unsettling way a person slowly convinces themselves that cruelty is righteousness. The police seized Karen's electronics and unearthed a trail of digital footprints that painted a chilling picture. Her laptop browser history was filled with conspiracy blogs, fear-mongering videos, and forums about hidden threats in everyday objects. In one forum, she posted anonymously under the username Safe Haven Watcher, ranting about disabled decoys, suggesting children with special needs were being used to funnel contraband into peaceful communities. She cited obscure videos and even referenced my house. "We have one on our block," she wrote just weeks before the shooting. "The child is erratic. The father is defensive. The bear is always there. Could be storage. Could be distraction." She wasn't guessing, she was targeting. Worse, they found emails between Karen and 2 HOA board members. In them, she outlined her suspicions about Ellie in clinical, disturbing detail. She described her behaviors, rocking, humming, speaking to her toy, as concerning patterns and urged the board to act. Instead of shutting her down, one board member responded, "Keep an eye out. Better safe than sorry." That same member resigned quietly after the email surfaced. No he paledi. No press statement, just silence. The investigation also revealed something else, something that made my skin crawl. Karen had been surveilling us for months, not just watching from her window. She had planted a second tracker, this time under our car. When the forensics team swept the vehicle, they found it neatly lodged above the rear wheel well. She'd used an app to monitor our movements, even noting the times Ellie left for therapy or school. On her tablet, they found a digital file labeled Ellie Log. Inside were timestamps, photos, and notes. Left porch at 8:10 a.m. bear present. Unattended for 3 minutes. Sang to the bear again. Said the word say 5 times. It was obsessive, unhinged, and it went far beyond concern. This was stalking. This was predation masquerading as neighborhood vigilance. When this evidence was presented to the judge during pre-trial hearings, even the courtroom seemed to inhale. Karen's attorney tried to spin it, claiming she suffered from community protection syndrome, a vague term invented to describe obsessive-compulsive behavior tied to HOA culture. But it didn't land. The facts were too ugly. The pattern too deliberate. One investigator told me privately she didn't just convince herself your daughter was a threat, she built a world where hurting her felt like heroism. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of Ellie's room, watching her breathe, thinking how close we came to losing her to a fantasy. The power reveal came in pieces. Slowly, the web of HOA complicity unraveled. Karen had served as HOA president for 6 years, and during that time, she had reported over 40 families for infractions ranging from excessive lawn gnome display to unsupervised minor behavior. Most of those reports were ignored, but 5 of them were acted on, all families of color, immigrants, or those with disabled children. The pattern was clear. Discrimination hidden under the cover of policy. When confronted, the HOA board released a limp statement about regret and reevaluation, but they didn't apologize. They didn't denounce Karen. That's when I took it to the media again. I released the emails. I released parts of Karen's forum posts. And I named the board members who had enabled her. The community turned fast. Protests formed outside the HOA office. Signs went up across front yards. We stand with Ellie. The silence was broken. The power structure cracked. And then came the hearing, the moment Karen's entire delusion was laid bare. The prosecutor, calm and methodical, read from her posts, showed the footage, played the 911 call. Karen sat in the courtroom stone-faced, occasionally shaking her head like she couldn't believe she was being punished. But the moment of reckoning came when they showed the video log from her phone. One clip, just a day before the shooting, showed her whispering to herself, phone camera aimed at our porch. It has to stop. She won't put it down. They all think I'm crazy. But I know I'm right. In that moment, the courtroom seemed to shrink. Every person could feel it. This wasn't about a bear. This wasn't about a child. This was about control and a woman who had been given too much rope and no oversight. When it ended, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed. The system we trusted to protect us had failed us at every level, from community boards to law enforcement to mental health. But I also felt clarity. Karen didn't just pull a trigger that day. She fired the final shot in a war she'd been waging for months. A war no one else wanted to acknowledge until it was too late. Ellie asked me once, why did she think Button was bad? I looked into her big, innocent eyes and said the only thing I could. Some people don't understand love unless it looks like their own. She nodded. That's sad, she whispered. Button just wanted to help. And he did, in more ways than we ever knew. The public reckoning didn't begin in the courtroom. It began in the hearts of the people watching. The moment our story went viral, a tidal wave of outrage and empathy crashed over every part of our lives. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about what she represented, a culture that cloaks cruelty in the language of order, that calls prejudice concern, and that lets people with unchecked power make war on innocence without consequence. News outlets covered it nonstop. From primetime anchors to grassroots podcasts, Ellie's name was spoken with reverence, as if her pain had finally forced a sleeping nation to open its eyes. disability advocates flooded social media with stories, using hashtag Justice for Ellie as a rallying cry. Parents shared photos of their own children holding stuffed animals. Veterans and teachers stood in solidarity. Artists drew Button with angel wings. Protesters stood outside HOA offices and suburban courtrooms with handmade signs that read, "My comfort isn't a threat. Protect children, not power, and no more Karens with guns." For every hateful comment online, and there were many, 1,000 voices rose louder, demanding systemic change. The HOA tried to hide, but it was too late. Their silent complicity had become a national scandal. The board president resigned. 2 other members were forced to testify about the ignored warnings, the email threads, the years of passive acceptance. The governor released a statement condemning neighborhood harassment masquerading as regulation, and lawmakers began drafting what became known as the Ellie Law, legislation to prevent HOA overreach, enforce mental evaluations for armed community members, and protect disabled children from targeted abuse. We were invited to speak at a town hall. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to relive the trauma. But Ellie, she wanted to speak. Not with words, exactly. She held up Button's glass box before a silent auditorium and whispered, "He's not scary. He's just mine." That moment made headlines around the world. Her tiny voice against a massive machine, and it cut through the noise like truth always does. Karen became infamous. Her mugshot was everywhere. She was fired from her job, expelled from every community group she once controlled. But even that felt like too little, too late, because Ellie still wakes up with nightmares, still flinches when strangers raise their voices, still whispers to Button through glass instead of holding him. What Karen took from us, the trust, the normalcy, the quiet peace of everyday moments, can't be restored with a verdict or a hashtag. But what she gave us, unintentionally, was a platform, a voice, a story that refuses to die quietly. Schools began inviting us to speak about disability awareness. Police departments restructured their neighborhood response teams. HOAs across the country rewrote their policies, explicitly including protections for children with special needs. And neighbors, once strangers, brought more than flowers. They brought change. One man donated bulletproof backpacks for children with sensory conditions. Another woman created a nonprofit in Ellie's name, distributing comforting toys to kids who'd experienced trauma. I cried when I saw the first batch of Button replicas arrive, stitched with a little tag that read, "You are safe. You are brave." Ellie smiled when I showed her. "He's not alone anymore," she said. The public reckoning didn't erase the pain, but it ensured the silence wouldn't return. It made Ellie more than a news story. It made her a symbol, a mirror, a wake-up call to every parent, every official, every neighbor who ever stayed quiet when they should have spoken up. And while justice may have worn a courtroom robe, the real reckoning came from the people, from the children who drew pictures, from the parents who showed up to vote, from the strangers who finally understood what it means when someone says, "That toy is their world." In the end, Karen lost everything. But we didn't win because she fell. We won because Ellie rose. The weeks after the trial passed slowly, like healing wounds you can't stop picking at. Life didn't snap back to normal. It never does after something like that. But it found a new rhythm, quieter and softer, like walking across broken glass barefoot and learning how to step without pain. Ellie started smiling again, not always, but sometimes. She began letting the new bear, Hope, sleep next to Button's case, not touching him, but close like a friend keeping watch. There were nights she still woke up crying, calling out, asking if Button was okay, if the porch was safe. Each time, I held her tight and whispered, "He's safe now, and so are you." Some days, we'd sit near the window, not on the porch, just inside it, where the light touched the curtains. We watched squirrels dance along the rail. She once pointed and whispered, "They're not scared anymore." And I knew she wasn't talking about the squirrels. Her laughter returned in pieces, small, precious things. A joke about spaghetti noodles, a drawing of Button with sunglasses, a whispered song she made up while braiding her own hair. These weren't signs that everything was healed. but they were proof that healing had begun. For me, forgiveness came harder. Not for Karen, I don't know if I'll ever forgive her, but for the people who stayed silent, for the board members who laughed at her obsession, for the system that waited until blood was spilled before it listened. I had to work through that darkness, piece by piece, in therapy, in prayer, in silence. But I kept reminding myself that Ellie needed not just a protector, but a peaceful home. She needed softness, and I had to be strong enough to create it. I planted lavender under the porch. I repainted the swing just the way she liked it, and I built a small wooden plaque that hangs above the front door now. It says, "You are safe here." It's not for the neighbors. It's for her. For us. One afternoon, months later, Ellie surprised me. She stepped onto the porch alone, barefoot, with hope in one hand. I watched from inside, heart pounding. She sat down gently on the swing, rocked back and forth 3 times, then looked up at the sky. Her hair caught the breeze. She closed her eyes and whispered something I couldn't hear. And then she turned, looked right at the camera above the door, and smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't long, but it was real, and in that second, I knew she had taken her space back. That porch wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was hers again. What happened to us changed everything, but it didn't destroy us. And as I look at my daughter now, scarred but whole, quiet but powerful, I realize that she never stopped being brave. She just had to learn how to be brave in a world that didn't deserve her strength. And now, every step she takes, every time she hums, every glance she gives Button's glass box, reminds me, strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a soft voice in a hard world. Sometimes it's a stuffed bear with a stitched eye and a hole in its chest. Sometimes it's surviving what was meant to break you, and smiling anyway. People always say, it's just a toy, until they realize what that toy represents. For my daughter, Button wasn't a plaything. He was her anchor in a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too cruel. And in one moment of fear-driven ignorance, someone shattered that anchor with a single shot. But Ellie didn't stay broken. She didn't let that act define her. She rose, quietly, courageously, and taught the world what true strength looks like. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in resilience. In reclaiming the porch where she was hurt, in hugging a new bear with the same love she once gave Button, in choosing joy despite everything. This story isn't just about a woman with a gun and a hateful heart. It's about what happens when communities ignore the warning signs, when systems fail to protect the most vulnerable, when fear is allowed to masquerade as authority. But more importantly, it's about what can happen when people finally speak up, when voices rise, when stories like Ellie's are shared, not as tragedy, but as truth. If you're watching this, I want you to take something with you. Look out for each other. Question the rules that feel unfair. Speak up for those who can't. And never, ever assume that someone's comfort is a threat just because you don't understand it. Love comes in many forms, and sometimes it's stitched inside a small stuffed bear with one eye and a lavender heart. We may have started the story in silence, but we end it with a voice, one that refuses to be ignored again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for standing with Ellie. And if this story moved you, if you felt her pain, her courage, her journey, then help us keep telling these stories. Because for every HOA Karen, there's a family suffering in silence. You can make sure their voices are heard. Backhand Index Pointing Right, subscribe, share, and join the fight for truth and justice right here on the HOA Stories.